event is themed Accelerating Progress on Sustainable Development Goals with Data for Development. Ladies and gentlemen, digital transformation has seen a meteoric rise in recent times, underpinned by the proliferation of big data and artificial intelligence. Leveraging these resources to access data points quickly is now paramount for both achieving global objectives as well as promoting sustainable development across international borders. This was further highlighted at the 2019 G20 summit, where commitments were made towards harnessing digital growth towards achieving SDG goals. During Italy's presidency in 2021, G20 leaders emphasized that harnessing the wealth of data produced by digitalization is critical to better inform our decisions. And at the 2022 Bali summit, a commitment was announced to facilitate a comprehensive digital transformation that would be both inclusive and enabling on a global scale. India's presidency presented plans for expanding data for development capabilities worldwide with capacity building initiatives in developing countries such as LDCs and SIDS, where urgent actions are required to bring the SDGs on track. The first development working group meeting held in Mumbai underscored these goals through tangible examples from Bangladesh, Estonia, India, Japan, Togo, and UAE, illuminating challenges related to silo management, along with looking at opportunities for innovation and technological experimentation. Ladies and gentlemen, today indeed is a momentous occasion as India's G20 Secretariat, Ministry of External Affairs, and other esteemed organizations such as Digital Impact Alliance and United Nations Conference on Trade and Development joined forces to host this noteworthy event with the theme Accelerating Progress on Sustainable Development Goals with Data for Development. Ladies and gentlemen, today representatives from diverse backgrounds have come together to further their combined understanding on these vital topics. The day will feature keynote addresses along with 2 plenary sessions and demonstrations of D4D, and this promises, ladies and gentlemen, to be an enlightening experience for all of us involved. It is my honor that you have all joined us today. And now to render the opening remarks and the context for the day, may I request Development Working Group Co-Chair and Joint Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Ambassador Nagaraj Naidu, to kindly join us on stage and please render the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Ambassador Nagaraj Naidu.
Colleagues, dear friends, a very good morning to all of you. Hopefully all of you have rested. This is Kumarakom, a very quaint village in the backwaters. This is a place to actually relax, and we hope that the salubrious weather that you find over here will rejuvenate you, and hopefully we'll have a very, very successful TWG. Before I start, to just tell you, this is a very unique hall. Anybody making a noise will completely transform into a commotion. So I would request everybody to keep silent. Otherwise, the way this hall is structured, this hall is meant for marriage halls. So we have converted this specially for a convention. So I would request everybody sitting behind to take it easy, not to talk too much or gossip. If you want to do that, you could do that outside this hall, so that the conversations reach to you. Otherwise, it is all lost in translation. To start with, I think all of you have seen the agenda for data for development, and very much upfront you see that in 2021, the world has consumed 79 zettabytes of data. Whether that data is getting copied, whether it is getting curated or absorbed or stored, what does zettabyte even mean? The 21 additional zeros to a digit might not make much sense to you and me, but for data analytics, this can translate into huge data intelligence that can feed into policy making. Today, we are at an age and time where data is only going to increase, our consumption of data is going to rise. It is said that 185 zettabytes of data is going to be consumed by 2025 or before. How do we make sense of all of this, and how is it possible for us to use data for our development? So this is the area of focus. It's a key area of priority for us during India's presidency. And today's event in the morning that we're going to have are a set of conversations which will enable us to perhaps look at data from a development perspective. While we all understand the issues pertaining to data privacy, data free flow with trust, all of this will only come about if we all realize the value of data. Unless we realize the value of data, the question of data free flow with trust doesn't arise. You and me, we need to be comfortable with data flows. We need to understand what is about data. How can data be curated? How can it be effectively utilized? Data is only good if it is timely, if it is reliable, if it is accessible. So we as citizens of this world, as governments, as institutions, need to effectively utilize data for the development and the larger social good. For example, we all look at Earth observation satellite data. If you had looked at the raw satellite data, it would not make any sense to the common human eye. It's all black and white. Till a data analyst applies the three primary colors, and then from the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, and then you see what happens to the same raw satellite data. When everybody says data is the new oil, that data is good only if it is processed, or it is as good as crude oil. So going forth, I think our conversations here during the DWG, as well as in the morning session, I think we will be directing these conversations to enable you to understand how valuable data is in efficient resource allocation, in smart delivery of public services, as well as in public policy making. So this is our endeavor, and we have put together a good program, and we are very, very hopeful that all of you will participate in these deliberations and contribute to the richness of what we plan to do. As part of our priority, all of you are aware that we want a heavy focus on capacity for data for development. If it is possible for all of us to agree to the creation of a global network that could deliver data for the larger good of this planet. With that, I welcome all of you to Kumarakom, and I wish the panelists and the speakers for a very, very productive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for setting the context for the day and also providing us with a momentum for the day. Ladies and gentlemen, to begin today's proceedings, we have a video message first from Shri Suman Beri, Vice Chairperson, Niti Aayog, Government of India. Mr. Beri is a distinguished public figure with an impressive portfolio of accomplishments, having served as Director General Chief Executive of the National Council for Applied Economic Research in New Delhi. Mr. Beri was at various times member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, of India's Statistical Commission, and of the Reserve Bank of India's Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy. And currently, as I said, he's serving as Vice Chairperson of Niti Aayog. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at that audio visual, a keynote message from Shri Suman Beri.
Excellencies, delegates, heads of international organizations, and my colleagues from India. I'm Suman Beri, Vice Chairman, Niti Aayog, and it gives me great pleasure to address you at the side event of the G20 Development Working Group's second session on the theme of data for development. Digitized data, if of appropriate quality, has the power to transform processes, enable informed policy making, monitor progress, and also to evaluate the efficiency and efficacy of policies after implementation. Developing countries in particular must now prioritize data-related capacities to empower people as creators, exporters, innovators in the digital present and future. Investment in technologies, developing human skills, and regulatory frameworks is crucial. However, developing countries face challenges in reaping the benefits of high-quality data owing to the often prevalent digital divide. Bridging these gaps requires a greater focus on capacity, creating enabling environments for leveraging data from both public and private sources, and both administrative data and survey data. Each country must do this on its own, but there is need urgently to improve international cooperation if we are to achieve the full social and economic potential of data transformation, always being mindful of unintended consequences. Leveraging the digital transformation and therefore data for development will be crucial to achieving the 2030 agenda. Data and data-related technologies are critical enablers for accelerating progress on the SDGs. Through the Development Working Group, G20 member nations should collaborate and establish priorities and deliverables, thereby creating a template for accelerating the achievement of the SDGs. Representing the voice of the Global South, India's Development Working Group has suggested a deliverable, the G20 Action Plan. An essential element in the G20 Action Plan are the proposed G20 principles on data for development, together with a proposal to create a G20 capacity building network for developing countries. Turning now to India, India has been harnessing data for its socio-economic development, particularly rapidly in recent years, and it's not an exaggeration to say that almost every sector has been positively influenced by its use. In the delivery of government services, poverty alleviation and subsidy distribution schemes of the government are making use of data analytics to identify suitable beneficiaries, to understand and verify their socioeconomic status, and use all kinds of imaginative technological solutions for timely dissemination of benefits. This has been instrumental in creating a significant positive impact and in learning from the process, both technologically and in terms of program design. Yes, access to data is necessary, but it is not sufficient. It is essential to have the capacity to convert the data into digital intelligence. India's SDG localization model is one example of this principle. By localization in India, we mean to the state level, because India is a union of states, but even to lower levels. And this involves the process of understanding, adapting, planning, implementing, and monitoring SDGs from national to local levels by relevant institutions at each stage, creating a need for reliable data. At the subnational level, states and our union territories have created discrete institutional structures for the implementation of SDGs relevant to their own specific context, and a very important part of creating ownership of the SDGs is widespread stakeholder consultations. All states have identified and tasked specific departments for SDG implementation. Partnership with civil society and business has brought about transformations at a speed and scale necessary to achieve the SDGs. Turning to a different level, from India's states are composed of districts, and Niti Aayog has also developed and released a district SDG index. The construction of the index and the ensuing methodology embodies the central objectives of measuring the performance of districts on the SDGs and ranking them. At this point, I should mention that India operates on the basis of cooperative and competitive federalism. So a very important role for NITI, other than verifying data that comes from the states and union territories, is to make these available on common dashboards. And it is remarkable what impact this process of comparison has on accountability and competitive performance across jurisdictions. The dashboards allow for region-level and district-level insights, and as I've said, are a powerful tool for extracting important knowledge. The launch of a capacity-building network among G20 member nations with a commitment to sharing training and resources will be a welcome move towards international cooperation in data for development, and I wish the discussion on this topic in the main development working group every success. Thank you for your attention.
We thank Sri Suman Berry for his keynote message. And ladies and gentlemen, now we have a video message from Sri Indermeet Gill, who is the Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and Senior Vice President for Development Economics. And he brings to the role a broad combination of leadership, expertise, and practical experience working with governments on macroeconomic imbalances, growth, poverty, institutions, conflict, as well as climate change. So we have Sri Indermeet Gill, Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and Senior Vice President for Development Economics. Let's take a look at that video.
Thank you very much to the Government of India for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you today. I wish I could have been there to speak with you in person. The Government of India, in its role as the G20 President, and the members of the G20 Development Working Group have taken an important step to emphasize the central role of data for development. These last few years have seen multiple overlapping crises which have hurt developing countries the most. Fragile, low and middle-income countries have all suffered in different ways. To help them engineer a lasting recovery, governments need data and analytics, now more than ever, to put in place the right programs and policies to deliver help to people who need it the most. Without timely and reliable data, policymakers are flying blind. That will inevitably lead to crashes. So when we published our Poverty and Shared Prosperity report a few months ago, I was struck by how poor and patchy the data on poverty and living standards are. We were trying to estimate the impact of the corona crisis on the poor, and it was nearly impossible to do so. When data is scarce, it tests the ingenuity and patience of experts. It keeps us from finding out trends and patterns so that we can inform policymakers and they can make evidence-based decisions. So another example is labor market data. So as you know, creating jobs for youth is a top policy priority in most developing countries. Female labor force participation rates are the single most important factor for long-term growth in many countries. Yet in countries that need it the most, these data are simply not available, or the data are so hotly contested that policy making comes to an impasse. So the stakes are very high. So I just want to give you a few examples of the insights we have gained because of recent investments in data and in analytics. So we know, for example, that for every 1% increase in global food prices, 10 million people fall into extreme poverty. We also know that if left unchecked, climate change could push up to 130 million people into poverty over the next 10 years. It could cause more than 200 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. We know that right now, 339 million people need urgent international emergency support. That's a record high. Yet helping them is harder than it needs to be because only half the necessary data are available. Crisis response efforts, development and peace operations are all much less effective than they could be. So these insights are driving the World Bank's work with partners around the world. We are ramping up our investments in country data systems, in data institutions, and in the human capacity to produce and use data and statistics for effective policymaking. In fact, the World Bank is the single largest provider of funding for data and statistical systems covering emerging economies. Much of this work is guided by the priorities and the opportunities identified in our 2021 World Development Report that was called Data for Better Lives. So in the coming year, the bank is committing an additional 1.3 billion to data, together with grants through our new Global Data Facility Trust Fund. In short, we are fully committed to putting data to work for social, economic, and sustainable development. But obviously, we can't do this without the support of governments. So I find it very encouraging that India, my own country, is proposing as G20 chair that we join forces to step up and coordinate support for data and statistics in low and middle income countries. I am very, very heartened by this. So thank you all very much. We look forward to working with you on next steps.
We thank Sri Gill for his message, and ladies and gentlemen, now we have a presentation on using data for development for increasing waste recycling. And for this, let me take the privilege of introducing and inviting Mr. Siddharth Hande, the founder of Kabadiwala Connect. He's a development sector specialist based in Chennai. He's a GIS expert experienced in delivering high-quality data-driven research. He's the founder and current CEO of Kabadiwala Connect, an award-winning social enterprise in the field of waste management. And at Kabadiwala Connect, his work focuses on developing scalable and inclusive solutions to the collection, aggregation, and processing of post-consumer waste in cities in the developing world. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Siddharth Hande.
Hi everyone, it's an absolute honor to be here. Thank you very much. So my name is Siddharth Hande. I'm a data scientist by training. I worked in the development sector for a number of years before starting Kabadiwala Connect. Kabadiwala Connect is a for-profit social enterprise that works to integrate the informal recycling supply chain into the formal waste management system. I just wanted to start with the issue of informality. It's a big development issue. There's a study which says that more than 60% of the world's employed population work in the informal economy. And in India, in cities in the global south, recycling is a very typical kind of ecosystem where you see a lot of informal work. You have waste pickers who go out, scavenge for materials that they think they can sell. They go to these small recycling or scrap shops or these waste aggregators who then sell it up the chain. But then there's a lot of formal businesses working as well. So in India, for example, PET, these water bottles that we have, well, it's not here, we have glass now, but these water bottles are actually recycled in a very, very serious way into yarn, into textile. And so a lot of movement around big brands saying that their materials are made out of ocean plastic actually comes from this kind of supply chain. When we look at, there was a lot, I worked in the development sector, I worked really in the academic field for a long time, and I noticed that when it comes to recycling and waste management, there was a lot of studies that spoke about the power of this informal recycling supply chain and how the fact that there was, one of the big issues was a lack of data that helped policymakers, helped private businesses work with these stakeholders more effectively. One of the big issues that I personally felt was that there was a big issue with consensus of these different stakeholders. We all, for example, we know that waste pickers are very active in recycling. But my lived experience in Chennai, which is the 6th largest city, it's on the East Coast, I know for a fact that a lot of waste pickers, but also a lot of residents, a lot of local businesses find their local scrap shop and sell their recyclables to them. So I felt that the scrap shops were really underrepresented in the literature, and especially when thinking of integration of these scrap shops, it was there was a lot of movement, there was a lot of work that could be done there. So what I focused was, and again, we won a grant from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, we won some financing from the World Economic Forum, as well as Expo 2020, to do the first ever census of every aggregator in my hometown of Chennai. So that was the goal. I wanted to walk street by street, and every time I found a scrap shop, I wanted to map them. I wanted to understand their business. I wanted to understand who they were, things like that. And so we started this work in 2017, walking every street, looking at different stakeholders in this recycling supply chain. And one thing that we found, or the data revealed, was that there were 3 clear types of stakeholders that came out. We all know the waste picker, which we didn't focus on a census, but with regards to, there were 2 other aggregators that we found. What we call a level 1 aggregator, who is essentially set up as a small kind of like space where waste pickers and local residents sell to them. And then you have these larger aggregators who are more like informal material recovery facilities. And these folks actually do the heavy lifting of pre-processing material, after which it's sent into different types of formal recycling. It's sent to different types of formal recyclers. So I'll just show you a map. Okay, actually maybe like little bit more about the data. So we know the waste picker. We know that they scavenge for material. They pick up, they find places where they think they can, where they think there's material for them to pick up. They sell to this small scrap shop who's actually material agnostic. It's kind of like a waste bank. They buy paper, plastic, glass, metal. In fact, from Kabadiwala Connect's perspective, we have found that they are very willing to collect more types of material on our behalf. And then you have these level 2 aggregators who are quite specialized. They sell in like big tonnage. And they also do some critical pre-processing of these materials, after which it's sold to a recycler. I love this map. Again, the level 1 aggregator map and the level 2 aggregator map are like really, really critical. This is where we focused our census or a complete data collection on. Especially the level 1 aggregators. This could be a map of ATMs that I'm showing you in my hometown, or this could be a map of like, small mom and pop shops. It's really amazing how many small aggregators there are in the city that can be kind of you can work with them to actually advance the circular economy or advance recycling targets and things like that. Whereas the level 2s are more clustered, they're really set up to actually send materials really far distances. This supply chain in Chennai was currently collecting 27% of the post-consumer recyclable waste that the city generated. That's 130,000 tons of material every year. That's millions of dollars worth of material collection. And if this was a formal contract, that would be a very, very large contract that the municipality gave out. So for us, this kind of data collection is really critical because it really shows us the power of this informal supply chain, but also gives us a clear direction into trying to develop value propositions that allow for these different types of stakeholders to work and get integrated into the formal supply chain. So Kabadiwala Connect, we're a for-profit social enterprise. Our goal or our proposal for the integration of the informal sector really follows through a few different paths. The first we really push is for enumeration. The second is to provide social protection to these stakeholders who are currently working. The third, and this is something that we are doing more and more now, is to work with the private sector to actually do digitalized procurement through this informal sector. So like I said, there's 130,000 tons of material being collected in Chennai. All of that material follows a general ledger system. So a waste picker goes and sells to a small shop, there's a bill. The small scrap shop sells to a large scrap shop, there's another bill. And so digitalizing those transactions are a critical kind of work area for us in making sure that we can integrate these stakeholders inclusively. The fourth, and this is the most important thing, is getting waste pickers not to choose between their health and livelihood by getting them to collect directly from households. And we have a pilot in Chennai where we've been working with one scrap shop and 2 waste pickers to organize the last mile waste collection from about 30 apartments. And this is something that's really exciting to us because it shows that you can trust a waste picker. You can trust these stakeholders in this informal recycling supply chain to work on our behalf. We offer 4 products in the market. Mapping is really our core. This is the key step for what we need to do and to really reveal who are the stakeholders in working in the city. Then we have informal sector traceability solutions. We work on procurement guarantees, and then ultimately we also work on this last mile collection, working specifically with the informal sector. We started out with grants, as I said, and accessing grants is still part of our strategy. But more and more, we are seeing more and more kind of like commercial work come our way, where there are a lot of folks really looking to manage their plastic footprint and to really push, the recycling of different types of plastics, especially low-value plastics. But it's not limited to plastic as well. It's really all the materials. So enabling the circular economy for post-consumer material is really our big kind of growth area. I'll end with this last point, where the work we do, we think it's very, very relevant in the global south. I think that especially when you look at the amount of circular jobs that are there in the global south, it's really, really fascinating. It's just that we need to collect this data to let their stories kind of come to the light and to allow policymakers to really build inclusive, evidence-based strategies. So my final point will be, I just want to say that, we live in an unprecedented time of the volume of data that's being collected, and it's really important that we analyze this and leverage this data, but there is still the hard work of collecting data on the ground, doing that primary data collection, especially as it relates to poverty alleviation and the integration of informal workers. I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hade, for that presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we now proceed to the first session on human-centric approaches to data for development. The importance of data and associated technologies in collecting, sharing, and analyzing high-quality information cannot be overemphasized when it comes to accelerating progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Digital intelligence generated through such measures will play an integral role in achieving inclusive development while respecting national laws. Appropriate data governance must also be established so necessary privacy protocols are adhered to. Above all else, efforts should strive towards a human-centric application that avoids creating any additional risks or harm for those involved. Let me now invite the panelists for this session with a little introduction. May I invite Ms. Claire Melamed, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. She's the CEO, ladies and gentlemen. Let's welcome her on stage with a round of applause. Dr. Claire Melamed, the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, was previously Managing Director of the Overseas Development Institute, and in 2014 she worked in the Office of the UN Secretary General, writing the report of the Independent Expert Advisory Group on the Data Revolution, A World That Counts. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am. May I invite Mr. Siddharth Shetty, the co-founder, Sehmati, and advisor, Digital Public Infrastructure, Ministry of Finance, India. A round of applause as we welcome him. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the applause. Mr. Shetty is a fellow at iSkirt Foundation, a non-profit technology think tank where he works on India Stack. He is the co-founder of Sehmati, a collective of account aggregator ecosystem that allows sharing of financial data in a secure and consented manner. He's also an advisor on digital public infrastructure for Ministry of Finance, India. May I invite Dr. Abhishek Bapna, who's currently the Director of Product Management for Google Research based in India. There he is. A warm welcome to you. Previously, he was the head of the Facebook app for India and led video ranking and monetization for Facebook. And before Facebook, he has led products for India's first unicorn in Mobi. and he has a PhD in operations research from Stanford University. Welcome. And ladies and gentlemen, now may I invite on stage our moderator, Ms. Laura Siren, Economic Affairs Officer, Digital Economy Policy Research Section, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Welcome, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, she's an applied economist at the UNCTAD, where she uses her research, quantitative and policy skills to support countries in shaping e-commerce and the digital economy towards more inclusive and sustainable societies. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am. With that, I will now request Dr. Siren to please take over the proceedings as our moderator. Ma'am.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me as moderator of this panel. As was already mentioned, the topic we're going to cover are the approaches to human-centric data for development, which aligns quite well with the work of this working group and the principles and building blocks that are going to be discussed in the next few days. And I'm very happy to be here with these three panelists who bring to the table a wealth of knowledge and experience, basically, on different aspects and perspectives on the topic around data for development. And as I think Ambassador Naidu mentioned earlier already, there's a huge potential for the data basically to accelerate the progress on the SDGs in the coming years. And we are currently at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, so this year is one, which really counts and where we can make a difference. But at the same time, the recent discussions have shown us that advancing data-driven technologies, it comes at a certain risk. And I believe last week we had saw an open letter signed by a lot of thought leaders and industry leaders on potentially halting training for AI models as long as we are not sufficiently clear about where are the adverse sides where this could go. And therefore, I think, it's imperative that we ensure that data collection, sharing, and analyzing of high-quality data is done in a fashion where we do not forget about the individuals who this is supposed to help. And I look very much forward to this discussion coming up now, where we will discuss these aspects to some extent. And to start off with, I would like to start with Claire, to ask you basically what are some of the challenges in promoting the use of human-centric data for development, and how do you think that participatory approaches like the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data can help to address these?
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a real pleasure, particularly given the focus of this G20 and of the Development Working Group conversations on data. My organisation is a network of over 700 members, including governments, including the private sector and civil society, who are all united in a common belief that data is an absolutely critical resource for development, and that the power of data can be leveraged to benefit people, to benefit our planet, and to benefit economies. And I know while I'm speaking today in a room full of people who very much also share that view, let me tell you, it is sometimes a lonely business to persuade people that data is in fact a critical input for development. So it is a delight to be here with so many of you and to be participating in a G20 process which is very much built on that premise. Data is power. We've already heard the words power and empower several times from those really interesting keynote speeches. Data is essential to giving individuals, to giving companies, to giving whole countries power over their decisions, control over their lives and over their destinies. It's an absolutely critical resource at every level. And while I know all of you share that view, let's just remind ourselves before we kick off the conversation on trust, how big the prize is if we get this right. We commissioned recently an investment case looking at the different studies, empirical studies that exist of the returns on investment for data systems, and the different calculations that have been done on if governments, if donors and others invest in data, what do they get back? there's a very broad spread, as you would expect, of such a diverse sector. But on average, every dollar invested in data systems gives you $32 in return. Now that, for those of you versed in public sector investments, is really a phenomenal return on investment, and one which is likely to grow, as we've been hearing, as the power of data only expands with new technologies. So the prize before us in terms of investments in capacity development, in some of the infrastructure on which these systems rely, and so on, is absolutely huge, and collective action is vital. So it's particularly important to be participating in these kind of multilateral processes here, rather than looking always at data as a single project or program level investment. I know we're going to get into some of the details later, but just to reinforce, resources is one critical part of the equation, investments, but the second absolutely critical part of the equation, and one that I know we're going to talk about a bit later on in this panel, is trust. I think we've seen again and again how some of the most well-meaning investments in data have fallen down, have failed ultimately, because they haven't brought stakeholders, brought the general public along with them. You know, and it's some of our most trusted institutions in my own country, the National Health Service, in globally the UN and so on, have got themselves into some quite tricky situations by not thinking through the consequences of needing to bring their stakeholders, bring the general public along with them in how they manage, in how they collect, in how they analyze the data, which is after all a representation of people's lives in numerical form. So it's really critical that we talk about trust, that we think about how we can involve people at all stages in the design, in the collection, in the analysis, and in the use of data. And it's through that, as much as through some of the investments that we're talking about also here, that we really start to get the full benefits of data and make sure that they're used in a way which gives people power, which reduces inequalities, and ultimately, of course, achieves the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much. This is perfect, basically, to go to our next panelist, and before we go to the further discussion of the points you raised, to Siddharth, in terms of your background and your experience, what are some of the key considerations in developing appropriate human-centric approaches for, well, in your case, maybe digital public infrastructure in particular and data for development, from both a technical point of view and potentially what are some of the legal aspects involved in this?
Sure. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you to the Ministry of External Affairs, UNCTAD, and DIAL for giving me a chance to speak at this wonderful opportunity. Before I dive in, let me share a framework that I find quite useful when we think about data, because there are actually different types of data, different categories of data. And then the way you manage them, the way you design policy and institutional frameworks is actually different depending on what type or category of data we are actually dealing with. So one is essentially you have personal data. This is data / attributes linked to the identity of an individual or an SME. We should not forget that while individuals have data, SMEs have data as well. And empowerment of both is extremely critical. And this could be raw profile attributes like a name, year of birth, gender, typically what gets classified as profiles in a driver's license or in an identity card, or different types of credentials. It could be the raw transaction data every time you swipe your card, the credit or debit that's generated in your transaction statement is also, or the loans that you take out, or you use Google Maps, the raw lat-long data that's linked to your identity. All of that is, again, personal data. And then companies may apply machine learning models on top of that, which is where you get into the domain of derived data. Again, derived data is linked to an individual's identity, but a good example is your credit score. It takes the raw transactional information, builds a model, and then that score is used downstream within the financial industry. All of this falls within the first bucket of personal data. The second category of data is non-personal data. Essentially, when you remove the individual attributes, the identifying attributes, think of the data that ChatGPT was trained on and other AI models. So there you start getting into the domain of anonymized data. They're not fully anonymized like statistical data sets, but it's somewhere in the middle. And that requires a very different policy intervention from the third category of data, which is open data. These are high-level statistics about the economy. Imagine COVID count in a region. Some of the presentations from earlier today talking about labor market statistics. All of that fits within the domain of open data, which basically you put out, you publish in different types of reports. And so when we think of these three categories, personal, non-personal, and open data, we could think of different tools to address that and drive empowerment across the regulatory and technology spectrum. I think in the personal data category, the idea of consent, because we spoke about agency, human-centric approach, which is really putting individuals in the center and ensuring that they use data for ways that empower them and not just for advertisements as the conventional industry is designed. And so there you really need to think about how do you give people control, how do they give consent, how is that consent informed, what are the institutional setups. One of the things India's worked on is this idea of consent managers that individuals can go to and then generate their consent in a very informed manner. And so this helps supplement what many jurisdictions have, which is the privacy frameworks, the privacy bills, the data protection bills. The second part, non-personal data, I think we need to do a lot more work around, how do you manage business confidentiality of those data sets, privacy of the individuals, and at the same time, the models that are coming in, the integrity and confidentiality of those models, yet open it up to the wider economy, to the wider set of innovators. And I think that's sort of something that there's a range of thinking that's happening today. And then open data, I think, is fairly well established. Governments for a long while and other agencies have been publishing metrics. And so, as you outlined the question, I think when we think about a human-centric view of data, we need to think about interventions that give individuals and SMEs control of their data, interventions that, ensure you can train high-quality models that then drive better offerings back to those individuals and SMEs. And then the third category, which is interventions that ensure that at a societal level, the policymakers are empowered with the right data sets so that they can target their schemes, which then finally flow back to the end individual and SME.
Thank you very much. I think this has already given us quite a bit in the direction of ideas of where this could go and what key considerations are. Then finally to Abhishek, from your perspective, which I don't know, it might be different given that you have a more private sector background, but what do you think are some specific examples of human-centric approaches to data, and which ones do you think have most promise in this context?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honor to be in a room full of leaders from around the world who are all really thinking hard about how we bring data to bear to some of the most important problems that are pressing humanity. And what I'd like to share today is both some specific examples of the journeys that Google has experienced over the past many years. We sort of pivoted to an AI-first company 6 years ago. We laid down the core principles of how we want to think about data and what the efficacy of AI should look like about 6 years ago. And what that journey has looked like in terms of us understanding how to have the maximum possible benefit to society through the tools, through the data that we have access to, and how we have kind of codified and institutionalized some of those processes, tools, and methods to make sure that we can maximize this benefit. So if you pick any domain, and I'd pick a few for example, language being one that I care deeply about because I think it's such a primitive construct that flows almost like the blood in the veins of any other problem, right? For inclusion, for making sure that marginalized communities around the world have access to the most important information out there, for their voices to be heard, language is a primitive element. Now this element and how this rides on technology and amplifies these voices around the world is fundamentally changing right now. Like everything you're seeing around the AI revolution that's happening around you, where weeks are looking like the amount of progress that you can make in decades, is all about language. And there are 7,000 languages in the world. How do you make sure that all of these advances are reaching all of these people around the world that may not be speaking the most dominant languages around the world? And as we've gone through this process, we've seen that time and again, that the principles that we laid down for us at the very beginning to make sure that we maximize benefit to society, to make sure we do everything in a manner that minimizes bias in these models. How do we make sure that there's maximum representation, safety, accountability for these models, that there is a process by which everything is private by design, it's not an afterthought, where we build the right technologies, the primitive technologies, and there's many examples we've built, differential privacy, federated learning, we bake privacy right into the phone, so that much of this is not something that others have to worry about, it is just by design. And so many of these journeys were thinking through the core primitive technologies, thinking through the institutional frameworks and principles, and then really focusing on the tools that enable for a really simple way for stakeholders around the world to inspect the data, to understand and explain what's happening in the data, to have provenance and traceability of where this data came from, to understand how to have safety guardrails so that it's not misused for the wrong purposes. These are all problems that we've grappled with on every one of these adventures. So I mentioned language. Health is, of course, another big one. We have several examples. Most recently, we announced the Open Health Stack, which was recognized as a digital public good by the SDG. And what that does is it creates a framework on the Android device for you to enable community healthcare workers around the world to interact with patients, to collect the data, maybe in offline mode, and still feel that the patients are completely safe, like the data is completely safe. Even when you're not connected, it's stored on the phone in a secure manner. And that stack is now being widely used by various agencies and nonprofits and government institutions around the world to interact with their patients. So there's several examples, and I'm happy to share more. But I think language, and I'll speak about agriculture later today as well. I think that's a third one that we care deeply about. But there's a strong set of examples that we can talk about.
Thank you very much. So from what I've heard, there's a common theme, and well, what you all three have addressed is, which is basically the idea of trust and consent involved in actually making data work for people, basically, and development. I would be interested in hearing more about that, basically. So maybe we start again with Claire. So your idea of how do you build trust and make sure that people do trust, basically, in how their data is going to be used and that it can be used for good.
Thank you. I mean, trust ultimately is about two things. It's about the relationships between people who know enough about each other to trust each other, and then it's about the institutions which can underpin and safeguard those relationships. And I think when it comes to data, trust is really critical for at least two ways. Firstly, because it's a critically important principle that data is used to support people's aspirations, to improve people's lives. Data is powerful, as we know, and that power can be used to help people. It can also be used to harm people. And so it's very much the principles underlying a data system which supports the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals that require that trust. But trust is relevant in a more practical way as well, and is very much a sort of practical instrument at the heart of having data systems which work. We work at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. We work with around 40 different countries. One of those is Senegal. And you were just mentioning agriculture and the critical importance of data for agriculture. In Senegal, one of the challenges with agriculture data was a lack of trust in the data. that there was a sense in which the data that was produced by the Ministry of Agriculture and other institutions was unreliable, the quality was poor, it wasn't timely enough, and so on. And changing that situation was partly a consequence of some of the very practical investments in capacity development, for example, that we'll be hearing about later, and skills. But it was also a question of trust, of pulling together some of the different stakeholders across the system, farmers' organizations, think tanks, the Statistical Office, the Ministry of Agriculture, and so on, pulling them together in a largely informal group to learn from each other, to understand each other's frustrations, some of the challenges that different institutions were facing in the collection and use of data, and together use that trust that was being built through that group to improve the data for agriculture, the data that underpins the agricultural decision-making in Senegal in some very practical ways. And it's now, there's far more capacity, for example, and far more use of satellite imagery for agricultural decision-making, which, as we know, is absolutely critical for providing the sort of timely data that can help governments to know in what regions they need to distribute climate-resistant crops most urgently, when it's time to develop the marketing campaign, and so on. So it's it's marrying some of the technical advances that are possible in capacity development, in infrastructure, and merging different kinds of data together with some of these both formal and informal mechanisms that can help build trust and make everybody understand what goes in, what comes out, and how to use the data, which is the absolutely critical different components for the kind of modern data systems that I think we're all so excited about.
Thank you. Basically linking to that, Siddharth, from my understanding of how account aggregators work, this is, well, trust on a very large scale. How does this work, basically, of building consent-based models and instilling trust in these?
So if we look at it and we sort of break down trust in a few dimensions, I think one dimension is individual agency. And what's equally important on the other side is accountability, right? And I think both go hand in hand, which is accountability of the entities that consume, process, generate data. And there you want to ensure there are legislative frameworks and guardrails to minimize privacy harms that take place. And what we're also seeing is a paradigm where you have institutional trust complemented with trust in code. Some of what Abhishek mentioned, which was the privacy enhancing or the privacy preserving technologies of differential privacy, confidential computing, and a whole range of these are being developed, really allow you to supplement and rather complement your data governance regimes in many countries, even though you may have limited state capacity. But accountability is not enough, because if you just have a pure accountability framework, it implies you've removed all agency from the individuals and the SMEs. And that's where the account aggregator model came in, saying to supplement accountability, how do we truly give people the tools such that they can operationalize informed consent, operationalize the right to data portability, and principles like that. And so the way the account aggregator works very simply, that these are regulated by the central bank, but it's an interregulatory decision. So all of India's financial sector regulators are central bank, capital markets, insurance regulator, pension funds regulator, along with the Ministry of Finance, came together in 2016 to create the regulatory framework around account aggregators. And an individual can go to an account aggregator of their choice. Today there are about 10 in the market, so it's a federated ecosystem, it's not centralized. Data remains decentralized, and this is very important. So I go to an account aggregator. In a federated manner, I discover where my data resides, so you don't need a unique identity at all. The principle was very simple. An individual should be able to create a unified view, but no one in the system should have a unique view. So we decentralized the data, we federated the identity, and so you can link all your accounts. You can link your bank accounts, you can link your mutual fund accounts, you could link your tax accounts or your other health records in the future, and you'll have an ID, say Siddharth or Laura at the rate of AA1. Now tomorrow when you want to go to a lender, you just go to the lender, they'll ask you, okay, in order to underwrite, and one of the biggest issues facing emerging economies is really credit democratization, right? And can we shift from physical collateral to information collateral? Because with physical collateral, only about 10% of, for example, SMEs are being able to access credit from the formal sector. So if you need to shift to information collateral, you needed a trusted way for individuals to share that. And so now you can go to a lender, they'll say, okay, in order to give you this underwriting loan offer, I need access to your financial records. And so you'll give them your account aggregator ID, and in real time, they will send you a consent request saying what data they want, for what purpose, for what time period, how will they use it, when will it expire, so on and so forth. The user experience, of course, is defined by each account aggregator. So if you have a smartphone, it works differently. If you have a feature phone, it works differently. If you don't have a phone, it works differently. So it's very inclusive. And if you approve it, that is, you give your consent, then in real time, in an end-to-end encrypted manner, the data is shared. And so that's how, in a limited way, really data empowerment, or we're attempting to operationalize data empowerment within the financial sector to start off with, but there are similar initiatives for personal data and health and other sectors going forward. And today over, I think, 1 billion bank accounts have been live on this system, and similarly it's rolling out for investments and taxation and other types of data already.
Thank you very much. From, well, then the national perspective will zoom back out maybe to go to Abhishek. How do you see this by basically, well, given that you're one of the projects that you mentioned about different languages and their enabling power, how do you build trust across that many different countries basically? Is there an approach that your company takes there specifically?
Yes, I mean, I think this is just fundamental. Our mission is to make sure that information is organized and accessible and universally accessible. So I think the license to operate with users around the country means we need to understand and honor trust in all of its different settings and different cultural settings, different contextual settings. A good example is when it comes to AI, these models may have been trained on certain data sets. Those data sets may have certain populations represented in a different manner. Now, the onus is on the developers of these AI models to make sure that there is representation from around the world in these models, and we work really hard to make sure that there's systematic ways in which this representation takes effect. Now, this goes all the way from being able to understand what is missing in the data. So I think there are really important tools that need to be built and are being built by us to inspect. For instance, there is a tool that we call the language inspection tool, where you can look at a language model and understand how it's represented. I think another really important role that the whole ecosystem plays is in establishing benchmarks and evaluations of how these models perform and what they're trained on across different communities. And so I think that's a big role that academia and governments and other institutions play to standardize the ways for how these models should be evaluated against different contexts. There's also an input, right? Like there might be ways in which these models stereotype certain communities, or there might be certain ways in which there is gender bias, or there is a certain bias against marginalized communities. But I think it's solvable. It needs meticulous care. It needs an acknowledgement that this is an important issue. And in the spirit of marching fast, one needs to be extremely appreciative of all of the steps that need to be taken to be responsible in this direction.
Very good, thank you. I see we're slowly coming to the end of our time. So I'm going to turn, well, this around to some extent, given that you have a room more or less full of government representatives. I would like to know from you, what you would like to see from governments in that context, basically. And since this is likely to be the last round, we'll also reverse the order again. So Abhishek, would you want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, I think this room has a huge role to play. I think the pace at which the technologies are changing and the pace at which AI is bringing different capabilities to the whole ecosystem, I think it's really important for this room to be extremely sort of on the front foot in cricket terminologies in how to address these issues. And I think in 2019 we had written a white paper on how governments and regulators could play a big role, I think, in establishing fairness frameworks. Like, there are complicated societal trade-offs to be made by some of these models, and I think the onus should not be on individuals or companies to make those trade-offs. There should be well-established frameworks on how these come about. There are liability frameworks. There are different ways in which intellectual property flows through these ecosystems. There is an important way in which liability frameworks are established. There are safety guardrails. They may mean different things in different domains, in different verticals, and establishing a consistent framework of how safety for the end user should be thought of in these contexts is really important. There's important dimensions of how the whole system operates to bring trust in a more transparent manner. A good example is the way we think of nutrition labels of food. We need to bring that same simple understanding of what's happening behind this for the end user. So we've taken a first few steps on this, where every model now has a model card that is a simple nutritional label of what this model does, what its performance looks like, and that standard way of everyone interpreting what's going on behind the hood of these complicated things is really important for that element of trust. Same thing with data. There's a data card which very simply describes what is the exact set of data that went into a model, and the ability to have these standard, simple, primitive building blocks that are flowing through the ecosystem, where each one of them is validated in a simple manner, is a role that governments and regulators can definitely play in a big manner.
Thank you. Siddharth, well, I guess you have a lot of face time with government, but what would you think are the principles, basically, or ideas that government should embrace for good data for development in different countries?
I mean, on that question, and the topic is extremely exciting and very powerful, given that data can uplift educational outcomes, health outcomes, financial inclusion outcomes, and broader societal outcomes. I think if we could, or my wish list would be really in two directions. One, can we think of frameworks that give individuals and SMEs control of their data, and how would that work in an international manner? I think what that does is, when you give people that agency, for example, if two countries had to sit across a table and cooperate on a topic like health data, where, let's say, as an individual, I want to share my health records with a super specialist in another country to improve my own health outcomes for a second opinion, it's quite unlikely that two countries are going to agree on a framework for health data sharing at this point in time. But I, as an individual, if I am given my data back, I can always take those records and give it to someone else. I have that agency, I have that freedom. And so how do we, when it comes to personal data, really push in that direction? And what are the shared norms where we can give data back to individuals, back to SMEs in a verifiable, high integrity manner, and then let them drive the decisioning downstream? And then second is, when it comes to non-personal and open data, which is especially relevant for, when policymakers are looking at developmental outcomes, what is the shared infrastructure and shared networks we can create that can help accelerate it? We don't go down the path of replicating this time and again in every country. We have 190 plus countries. It will take us 2 centuries. But really, what are the shared networks that we can create that, while accelerate these outcomes, at the same time preserve sovereignty and preserve autonomy of the stakeholders that are generating, contributing that data? So it's not one common platform, but what are those shared structures? And if we can do that, it will really allow a lot of countries to leapfrog in terms of their own developmental agenda.
Thank you. And Claire, do you still have some concluding words on this?
Thank you so much. I mean, I think the first thing is, this is the development working group meeting. It's not an easy time for development. We're suffering very constrained resources, many growing challenges. And I think the first thing is, there is this huge data dividend here for the taking, that investments in data can ultimately save money and enable a much more efficient use of scarce resources in a time of growing need. So, I mean, I think that's the first thing, is just to sort of to ensure that data is underpinning all of the discussions here. But two things specifically, I think, in terms of action. One, of course, we've been hearing about already, the importance of thinking about this in terms of resources and ensuring that resources are invested wisely in capacity, in infrastructure and elsewhere, to make sure that we are overcoming existing divides in terms of the use of data and digital technologies, and certainly not creating new ones. So resources and the involvement of development partners in resources is the first. And the second is in partnerships. Data is very much a team sport. And the resources have to be used in a way which develops partnerships between the people about whom data is collected and the users of that data, between development partners and others, between the private and the public sector, and so on. Both at a national level and at a global level, partnerships are absolutely critical to how we use resources effectively to make sure that we are getting the benefits of all of the new technologies that we have in front of us, and making sure that, as I think is our responsibility, that we're using the world's best technologies, the world's best information to tackle the growing and desperate challenges that we face around the world. So thank you all, and wishing you very good luck in your discussions over the next few days.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I think those were very important insights that you shared, and with a very, optimistic outlook, basically. And I hope this will provide some food for thought for the next few days.
Thank you very much. I request the esteemed panelists to kindly stay with us on stage, and I invite DWG co-chair Ambassador Naidu to kindly join us on stage to present small tokens of our appreciation to the esteemed panelists. And may I also invite Mr. Siddharth Hande, founder Kabaddi Wala Connect. May I request you, sir, to also join us on stage so that we can felicitate your presence here as well. Mr. Siddharth Hande is here in our midst. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our moderator, Ms. Laura Cyron. Mr. Siddharth Shetty, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Ms. Claire Melamed, thank you, ma'am. And Dr. Abhishek Bapna. Please give us a group photo opportunity, esteemed panelists and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, sir, for doing the honors. Thank you, esteemed panelists, once again. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will now go on to the next talk for D4D in action. And for that, I'm actually going to welcome back on stage Dr. Abhishek Bapna, Director Product, Google Research. And after that, ladies and gentlemen, we have the plenary session. So welcome back, Dr. Abhishek.
Hi. So I'm back here to talk about the one piece that I mentioned I'm going to talk about later, which is agriculture. And it's an honor to share some of the work. This is early work from Google Research here in India, but we think we're building something really important for the India agricultural stack, and I'd love to share that with you. So agriculture, as many of you might know, is more than 50% of livelihoods in India are dependent on agriculture in some capacity. And we think that AI and data can play a truly remarkable role in making a tangible difference to this entire sort of fundamental building block of the whole country. And And so 3 years ago, we set up the Google Research Lab in India. And in those 3 years, we made some progress in understanding this problem and in addressing this problem, along with partners, including the governments in several states in India. So just to motivate the problem, like let's think of a farmer who wants to take a loan today in India. The company or the bank that's giving the loan to the farmer needs to address a bunch of questions. Like, where is this farm? If the farmer claims to be growing something or claims to have grown something in the past, like, does this farm actually grow that particular commodity? And what's the outlook going to look like for this year? What's the amount of rain that's expected this year? What's the forecast? And then what about soil quality? How do we understand whether all of these factors how are they going to play out? And given all of these conditions, whether this loan should be given to this farmer or not. On a problem like this, we think that data can play a fundamental role in streamlining and giving access to things like credit, which are fundamental to agriculture, to the right people at the right time for the right reasons. Yeah, this is okay? So this is the problem that we picked on, but we didn't want to address this directly by thinking of the credit problem. We thought of what is that fundamental building block, which might be the Aadhaar, like what Aadhaar was to UPI. What is that building block that is important for agriculture? And as we thought about this, we felt that the notion of a field in agriculture is that fundamental building block. There's a lot of research that has happened in agriculture over the past many decades in trying to understand various attributes from satellite data, but none of it has addressed this question of, for a given field, what do things look like? And when you get aggregate statistics at a district level or a state level or a certain geography or a certain set of kilometers, it's different. But when you can do this thing for an individual field, we think that the entire stack that is built on top of it will fundamentally revolutionize almost every operation in agriculture. So this is the model that we built. This model uses advanced computer vision techniques and satellite data that is publicly and privately accessible to identify various aspects of the field, to start with the field boundaries. Now this is not an easy problem. It might look like you can look at an image and just detect where the fields are, but this is a country of several million farmers. Each field looks different. Each field looks different in different seasons. There are different cloud covers that operate in different parts of the year. There is the same crop grown in different places looks very different, and identifying precise boundaries is a really hard problem. So we systematically attacked this problem and said, like, given advanced computer vision segmentation models, can we do this? And we have the state-of-the-art models when it comes to detecting these field boundaries. And we didn't want to stop there. So as you can see in this demo, there are several attributes of these fields that you can understand. You can understand whether there's a well on this field. You can understand if there's a pond nearby. You can understand if there's tree cover around this field. And so this aspect of understanding the whole landscape for a field became the next challenge that we took on. And we made significant progress in identifying all of these features. Now you can imagine that for someone who's planning the irrigation canals for the next set of investments, might want to understand what's already locally available in terms of wells and ponds for different farmers. And so this information is now available for us to start working with governments on. A good example of how this is being used, it was a pilot that we've been doing with the Telangana government. Here we take these field segmentation models and we've shared them with the government of Telangana. They in turn use these for their field surveyors. Now traditionally the field surveyors would have gone to the field. They would have hand-drawn like specific lat-longs for each part of the field. And this is a long, onerous process, having to do this for every particular farm in their district. Now with this, they have a pre-populated field segment that they now need to validate. So the problem has gone from creation of a boundary to the validation of a boundary, which is a much simpler problem for a surveyor to do. And that significantly accelerates the whole process and makes it much more efficient. And to hear more about this partnership, I'd like to play a short video from Ms. Rama Devi, who is the
Hello everyone.
the Director for Emerging
With the
Technologies for
advent
the
of
Government
the
of
fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0, way back in 2017, we set up a vertical in emerging technologies in Telangana and have since been focusing on areas like AI and cloud. One area where we can really unlock potential is agriculture. There are about 6 million farmers in Telangana and an estimated 100 million in the rest of the country. And we are implementing some very exciting projects in the state for them. At a foundational level, we are planning to set up a data exchange platform which will initially focus on agriculture. Think about it as comparable to UPI, a thin interface or a platform that serves as a transaction layer where different data providers, be it governments, startups, research institutes, and others that have relevant data to offer, can do so for others in the ecosystem to utilize in meaningful ways. The work done by the Google team will be a critical part of this. It will enable agriculture solutions at a field level that can benefit participants across the value chain. The potential is undoubtedly exciting.
So once we have the field boundaries, the next thing that we're working on is detecting what's growing there. So this is what we call field event detection. So all the way from understanding when a field was tilled, when it was harvested, what was grown there, if there was stubble burning on that field or not, we can now use advanced techniques to detect all of these events. And the hope is we make it really simple for policymakers, banks, and others to start utilizing all of this data. A separate problem that we're working on is understanding soil health. There is advanced hyperspectral imagery available, and we can use this to understand the health of soil, which again is a really important ingredient to make sure that agriculture is secure and food security exists. We're partnering with Princeton University and a startup, Nurture.com, on this problem. Another example is where we partnered with Vadhvani AI to understand how pests are influencing various crops. And in partnership with Vadhvani, we were able to deploy solutions for understanding whether a particular disease or a particular pest had infected a crop. And this was effective to the tune of 20% additional yield for these farmers in this pilot. Last but not the least, like I mentioned, my favorite topic, this is the language. So while it might seem at the outset that language has little to do with agriculture, but we think it has everything to do with agriculture. If you think of a farmer who's trying to understand the latest farming techniques that might be available in a video in YouTube, or someone's trying to understand how to use a particular piece of equipment, but they don't speak the language in which the manual was written, I think it's really important for access to this advanced information for language technologies to work across the board. So the 1,000 Language Initiative is something we announced last year. This is the desire to build a single model which can address language technologies in 1,000 languages. Most of the technologies, whether it's speech to text, text to speech, translation, they only work in about 50 to 150 languages. And we think that's not sufficient, and we want to, like, in the spirit of making sure that there's complete inclusion of all of this advanced AI revolution for everyone around the world, we made significant progress. So last month we announced this model called the Universal Speech Model. This model has 300 languages in it, and it's trained on data which is coming from all of these languages. We augment it with community projects. So we have this other project called Project Vani, where we're working with the Indian Institute of Science to understand how dialects vary across different parts of India. So in the entire northern belt, while we think of that as the Hindi-speaking belt, but there's at least like dozens of different variants of Hindi. There's Malvi, Kannauji, Awadhi that people speak there, and we want to make sure that our speech technologies understand and represent all of these communities. So with that, I'll stop here, and happy to take any questions offline.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Bapna. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly begin with the plenary session on the need for capacity building for data for development. We're just going to take a minute-long hiatus to just reset the days. So do not go away anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. Please stay with us. And I'd like to say, as digital economies and societies evolve at an ever-accelerating rate, it is becoming increasingly imperative that developing countries close the gap in turning data into digital intelligence. Doing so will enable them to respond to national priorities while also leveraging existing resources for a more prosperous future. To ensure this progress happens effectively, there is a rising need to close gaps in capabilities while providing appropriate governance. Ladies and gentlemen, now I'm going to invite our panelists on stage. Let me begin by inviting Ms. Diana Sang, Digital Impact Alliance, the Director for Country Strategy and Partnerships. Let's welcome her on stage with a big round of applause. Ms. Diana Sang. She's the Director for Country Strategy and Partnerships at the Digital Impact Alliance, is an expert in country program design, government engagement, and leading on cross-sector partnerships. Welcome, ma'am. Prior to joining the Alliance, she was a key figure at GSMA, shaping some of the organization's most successful mHealth projects across sub-Saharan Africa. Warm welcome once again. May I now invite Mr. Jojo Mehra, eGov Foundation. He leads the product management at eGov Foundation, India. He's a digital innovation professional, and there he is. Let's welcome him, ladies and gentlemen. He comes armed with experience in leading product development, business model innovation, and digital strategy. He was a part of the early team at some of the pioneering digital startups like Rediff.com and UMedia PLC, and also co-founded a shared accommodation platform and an HR tech startup. Welcome to you. May I invite Ms. Chrissy Mayer, Digital Public Goods Charter. She is a recognized thought leader, ladies and gentlemen. There she is. Let's welcome her on stage with a big round of applause. As I was saying, Ms. Chrissy Martin Mayer is a recognized thought leader in digital development with over a decade of experience managing complex initiatives which deliver positive results for people, and currently the director of the Charter for Digital Public Goods. She's drawing on her extensive technical expertise gained through working with organizations such as the World Bank, the Swiss Capacity Building Facility, GIZ, the Center for Financial Inclusion, and also USAID, and many others. Welcome, ma'am. May I invite Ms. Daphna Feinholz, and there she is from UNESCO. A big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the applause. Thank you, and welcome Dr. Feinholz. Ladies and gentlemen, she's the Chief of Bioethics and Ethics of Science and Technology, Division of Youth, Ethics and Sports at the Social and Human Sciences sector with UNESCO, a psychologist and bioethicist by training. She previously worked as a researcher in charge of reproductive epidemiology department and was a member of the Mexican Research Council, also the director of the Women and Health program in Mexico, the academic coordinator of the Mexican National Commission of the Human Genome, the executive director of the Mexican National Commission of Bioethics until she joined the UNESCO in 2009. Welcome, ma'am. And now may I invite the moderator for this session, Mr. Fayaz King. And he's the special advisor at the United Nations Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. King has spearheaded the implementation of several technological innovations, including digital products and overseen developments aimed at digitizing school education and healthcare. A very warm welcome to you, sir. I now hand over the proceedings of this session to you. Mr. Fayaz King.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you. Today we have an exciting panel to discuss the subject of capacity building. I think first and foremost, let me just set the stage by sharing a few thoughts around capacity building. For capacity building to take place for data for development, we know that digital is the vehicle for the digital economy, but data is the fuel. But in order to get the vehicle to move with the fuel, you need a driver. And the driver is the capacity building that we want to talk about today. To do this, we need to create capacity at 4 levels. The first level is that of our policy and legislators and advisors. This is what helps us create an enabling environment. The second level is that of our senior government and public officials, our researchers and developers. This helps support the enabling environment, as well as empowers and strengthens the organizations. The third or fourth and most critical level is that of the practitioners and technocrats. This is what helps strengthen not only the organizations, but also creates capacity at an individual level. And our last layer, which again is so important, are the people, the SMEs, the startups, the people who actually benefit or use the data. We need to create capacity at an individual level to build us up, to ensure that we have the right drivers to drive this vehicle that we call the digital economy. To help me unpack this, I'll start with our first question. Our first question is, what are the existing gaps in capacity building in data for development? And what are the roles of governments first, civil societies, international organizations, and private sectors in generating this capacity, with particular focus to developing countries? So we'll take it in bits and in pieces, and I'll get Diana to kick us off on that. Diana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fayaz, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think first it would be good just to ground the need for data for development, and particularly looking at how, given the advancements in digital transformation, one of the major features of that is increased amount of data that is being collected, that is being stored, that is being shared across the globe. And this has resulted in nations, different countries. One of the unique competitive edge, if I could call it, from a national level is the ability to really develop and maximize the digital intelligence, if I could call it, of which data is the driver. Looking at some of the gaps, I think for most developing countries, one of the underlying gaps that has a ripple effect on data is, of course, access and affordability of digital infrastructure. When you look at the imbalance between rural and urban, you have countries, for instance, I'll give an example of Sierra Leone, where in the rural areas, there's only 4.8% access of internet. That limits the national capacity to collect digital data. It limits also the availability of real-time and fast data access and use. So I think that's an underlying national capacity challenge that has many ripple effects on data for development. I think the other gap is around the siloed approach and investments towards data. And this is driven largely by the fragmented approach towards partnership, even at country level. This has led to separate systems and platforms, which has now spread the limited capacity that is available at national level in managing the many separate and individual systems and platforms and data ecosystems. So that has really stretched national capacity for data management, and I think it would be good to see how that can be consolidated and have a shared approach towards the access and use and management of data that can really maximize the limited available that is there, but then also grow the maximize how it can be used as well. I think, as Mr. King has mentioned, policy and regulatory gaps is a big challenge in many developing countries, not only at national level, but even at cross-border level. I think with the growth of international trade, international development, international cooperation, COVID saw the need and urgency for cross-border data sharing, but from a legal, policy, and regulatory perspective, there's a lot of lag in that perspective, and that limits how data can be used for good as well. I think thinking through now particularly on the role of government, I think government is really key as an enabler in providing the enabling digital infrastructure that can support thriving data ecosystems, in making sure also that there is the right policy environment to guide the collection, use, and sharing of data in a responsible manner. Thinking through some of the policy issues also is around the institutional frameworks. That is the role that the government has. So are there enabling institutional frameworks that will really guide and make sure there is that access and use of data at a national level is founded and guided by national policies, and also with the right accountability mechanisms. And one of the institutions key to that is, for instance, the Data Protection Agency. How is that structured? How are protocols and compliance around use of data at a national level governed? And are there very clear guidelines for different players in the ecosystem? If it is for government-to-government data use of data by development partners, guiding private-public partnerships also as well. How do we ensure that they're all grounded in very responsible policy and legal environments? I think lastly, thinking through the role of government also from an institutional framework is we have very different government systems, so sometimes there is a gap between centralized and local government. I think a role there that government really has to play is to make sure that there is a coordinated, more of a blueprint approach towards sharing between central government and then local government agencies that will really enhance the data sharing and data access across the country in an equal manner. I think I'll stop there for now.
Great, thanks Diana. Chrissy, maybe you'd like to weigh in a little bit on that.
I think that Diana provided a very thorough summary, so I'll be short. I'll just say when we look across, the mix of laws and policies, institutional arrangements, and technical architecture, I think there's a lot of attention that's paid to the laws and policies. There's emerging amounts of attention, especially with India's leadership, paid to the technical architecture. And I really think there's less attention being paid to those institutional arrangements in the civil society. So Diana mentioned already data protection agencies. We find that these rarely exist, and where they do exist, they have an extreme lack of resourcing, maybe with some catalytic financing from the global financing community, but that's not sustained over time. So I think that these civil society organizations, the capacity to really maintain grievance redressal mechanisms, right? Where do people go when they have a problem, and how is that going to be resolved? Not just this year or next year, but over time, and how do we adapt those to these new and emerging technologies that are coming rapidly, as we've heard this morning.
Thanks, Jojo.
Yeah, so our general view is when it comes to capacity and the gaps there, capacity is really required across multiple levels, right? Just starting from having the reimagination to see what you can do with these systems and what you can do with the data. And the next level, you're looking at the capacity to actually go and implement, to go and run, to go and operationalize these systems, to go and work with this data as well. And you also need capacity at the design level, you need capacity at the development level, you need capacity at the deployment level. And you also need capacity that's required in procuring these systems, and that's where the role of a trusted advisor comes in, that brings in multiple players from Samaj Sarkar Bazaar, right? That's from the civil society, from governments, from the private sector all together, and serves as a trusted advisor. So I think this is, our view is that this is multi-level and there's multiple stakeholders, is what you need to keep in mind while thinking of capacity.
Great. No, thanks, Jojo. Thanks for that. Daphna, would you like to weigh in on this as well?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to just say that probably some of the gaps that have probably already been addressed, but I think the awareness raising and of the civil society and of the users about the risks it has been already said, but how important is, because so many, we have, it's very, I always like to give this example. Many people say, I'm not important, I have nothing to hide. What is it about if they use my data? So I think there is a lot of awareness raising that needs to be done, and also about what are the ethical guidelines that we have to take into account, because it's not only for the civil society but also for those who are making the decisions about how are we going to use this data. Now, I think from the point of view of the international organizations, I think what we can do, and this is why I'm grateful that the UNESCO was invited, because we just 193 countries have signed and have adopted a recommendation of ethics of artificial intelligence, which aims to provide with a normative framework that will enable governments, private sector, and civil society. We're coming from a multi-stakeholder approach to provide with some systems and strong institutions, and to make sure that the collection of data and the use of data in artificial intelligence and all the digital world are really following this human-centered, as it was explained before. So for that, we have, with this recommendation that has values and principles that include all the values and principles that you might know, we also have a lot of policy areas, concrete policy areas. One of them are on data, and one of them, for example, says that governments should put in place mechanisms to ensure that there are redressal mechanisms in case individuals are harmed by decision made by artificial intelligence. And then the most important thing I want to focus on, because we are speaking about capacity, and I'm saying this because I think capacity building is a very different level. It's about how we build the national capacities, how we build the individual capacities of those who are sitting in the government making the decisions, how do we build capacities of those who are developing the technologies, making research, and then also, so it's at the different levels. Now, what we have done is that we have developed a tool to implement the recommendation, which is called the readiness assessment methodology. And that, what it means, there are many, I'm sure that you are familiar with many of these readiness assessment methodologies that exist, like Oxford and Stanford and Tortoise, etc., etc. What we did is an analysis of all these and came up with something that would be new. What can UNESCO can bring to it? So this technology, first of all, it goes to the primary information, not to the public information, because some of the problems, as had been said before, of the information that is public is that it's the information that gets to the standards, because it comes from the countries, basically from the north, who have the opportunity to invest in R&D, and that's why they make it to the indexes. But but there are many other things that are important, and maybe they are not expressed in the same jargon and some of those indexes, and still the information is there. The other important thing is that public information is also recollected not always from very pluralistic and inclusive sources like the World Bank, for example, but others from the very small institutions. So what UNESCO intends to do with this readiness assessment methodology is to include areas, six different areas, which are legal, education, scientific, infrastructure, and technical areas, each of them with qualitative and quantitative indicators. Then to go to the national, at the national level, to go to get this information with the primary data. It is a very long. I just want to give you an example. This is how it looks like, and I'll give you one of the examples. One of the quantitative question is, what is the score of your country in the cybersecurity index? Because this is about data protection and privacy laws. But then we have a lot of qualitative ones. For example, does your country have a data protection law? Has the efficiency of this data protection law has been assessed? Does the data protection law mention a notice and consent framework for specific cases it applies? Does it include a law enforcement mechanisms and compensation schemes in case of violations? This is just to give you an idea of, it's super detailed how we are going to do this. So the idea is to have a diagnosis of where the country is in order to deploy research, and because the idea of UNESCO is that it needs to be, we need to cover the whole life cycle of a technology. So since who is collecting the data? Is it pluralistic? Is it free of bias? Which are the teams? Where are the sources, etc., etc. So we want to come to a diagnosis of where the country is, and then to tailor-made a program that will prepare a roadmap for these countries to establish a national strategy and to know how to deal with the data collection. And it's also, we also developed an ethical impact assessment, which is also to enable those who are, and the government who will be able to assess what kind of tools they are going to for example, to buy. So they need to make sure that they know not only the technical part, but also the ethical implications of these tools, which might imply making an ex ante evaluation of the ethics, which with ChatGPT was the perfect example of not doing an ex ante evaluation of what could be the consequences, because all the biases were there. And then lastly, what we do as international organization, I think it's trying to build, as it has been already said, it's very important to share the experiences. And so there are many countries that have different levels of experiences in how to harvest this information and this data, how to collect it. So we have established a network that is called Ethics Without Borders. So we are gathering experts from all over the world to go and help doing these trainings, and in fact helping all the countries to conduct their own assessment with the readiness assessment methodology. We have established a network of ethics for women for ethics of AI, and every year we are having, and you are all invited to come if you want this year, probably 7th and 8th of December in Slovenia. We are convening, and this will be the second edition of the Global Forum, where we bring all the governments and also civil society and also all the developers together to share information and to gather and to share best practices.
Great. Thanks, Daphne, and thanks for that very comprehensive view in closing off that question. Distinguished delegates, capacities to harness data and turn it into digital intelligence is key, and adding value to data is quickly becoming an important factor in moving up the development process. Let me start the next session by asking Chrissy to come in on the need for capacity as a useful lever in building confidence of developing countries to participate in the international digital economy and data sharing. Chrissy, if you can give us a perspective, please.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so as mentioned, I've been working on this Charter for Digital Public Goods, which is kind of a fancy way of talking about open source for the public good. And I won't get into that, but one of the values that we've talked about when we look at open source is the fact that it allows people, countries, youth to be involved in the creation, customization, maintenance of the technology that's being used to collect and analyze data. And I think that this is a really important concept that I don't see talked about quite as much, right? So UNICEF did a study recently that showed, I think it was 25% of youth feel like they have any control over the digital technologies and the way that data will be used to control and define their lives going forward, right? So this is, we talked about trust in the last panel, this is a pretty terrifying statistic. And so I think that's a great concept that we can take from these conversations about open source when we think about what's the capacity that we need to build and how do we use that to build trust. You know, so we think about the digital mindset, right? It's breaking away from this idea that there can be one champion or one team within a government that knows about digital, that understands data, or that we can do capacity building, kind of teach one group of people about one system. We really need a population. I think we see that a lot in India and the work that they've done over the past decades, that understands digital and data and the opportunities and challenges. Maybe not 100%. They've done studies that show to be conversant in a language, you need to know 30% of the amount of that language that you need to know to be fluent, right? 3,000 words, not 10,000 words. So can we get to a point where everybody knows 30% of what it takes to just be conversant in data and the way that it impacts our lives? And I think that would go a long way to building the capacity at all levels, at all 4 levels that we need.
Great, thanks Chrissy, thanks for that. Jojo, eGov has been key in some of these developments here. Maybe you'd like to share an eGov perspective and a lot more around that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. King. So there are sets of data that are needed for international as well as national level coordination, right? And these are used to address some pressing challenges, and these challenges don't really respect any borders. So at the core of it, what you're talking about is the need for sharing and setting in place mechanism to enable this kind of sharing. And that leads to 2 things, right? 2 key things. One is enabling interoperability right at the design stage itself, where looking at sharing data, everyone understands that integration is painful, it's annoying, and no one really wants to do it. But if you think about interoperability from the design stage itself, it makes sharing of data a lot more feasible. Underpinning that really is the quality of the data, right? And we heard in the previous panel as well on how trustworthy that data is. Our view at eGov is that if you really want to improve the quality of the data, you've got to link it to real-time transactional data. So this is operating system emanating real-time transactional data, and that is what underpins trust in the system when it's done consistently and when this data is emanated. But yeah, so that's a view on basically looking at these 2 aspects, right? On how do you enable interoperability to encourage sharing, and how do you look at the quality of data which is generated from real-time transaction systems.
Great, thanks Jojo. Dana, from the Global South, how would that look?
I think when you're thinking about international digital economies and cooperation, one of the challenges that countries in the Global South face is the challenge between focusing on the processes that allow for data sharing and data processing, and then also addressing the security and privacy concerns that are there. And then amidst all these, trying to keep up with the fast-paced development and movement on this, particularly in the global north. So I think here, capacity can be a really strong lever where peer learning and national level peer learning can really drive the momentum and support, particularly where governments are in limbo between what to be more proactive on and to test, and then also where to really address some of the concerns that are there. So I think strengthening these peer learning platforms, supporting on best practice sharing between governments, particularly those in the Global South, where due to the shared challenges and shared, from a context perspective, I think we'll be able to leapfrog and jump and ride on a lot of the other systems and platforms and protocols that have already been in place. I think also from an international cooperation perspective, I think it's critical to also make sure that we work closely with regional bodies. So in the case, if it's the African Union, because these institutions are also guiding and setting a benchmark and a standard for other countries on what can be adopted now down into national policies. So that can be another way of making sure that there is a faster momentum from a capacity perspective, where we work closely with regional bodies that are working closely and bringing these countries together, and already have platforms for capacity building, for best practice sharing, and then also for policy comparisons and approvals.
Thanks, Diana. Daphna, would you like to weigh in with the last word on this question?
I would kind of echo what has just been said, because we have also been establishing this kind of regional networks, and basically in Africa, one of them, the other one in Latin America, and bringing together all the different stakeholders, as you say, and trying to see what are the best practices, what are the legislations, and then coming together in trying to bring to something that is more homogeneous. Because I think in part one of the things that are lacking is that this kind of cohesive also and system of collecting and on using this data. And I think there is a lot to learn also from the South. This is something I wanted to add, because I think there is a lot of information and there is a lot of knowledge that, since this is a bit what I wanted to say at the beginning, it's probably not expressed in the same way, in the same jargon as we are used in the digital world, but there are lots of things that we can learn, and how to get to that information, how to use it. And I think the part of the challenge and why I think it's very good about this presidency is focus on the Global South, because I think we need to bring the Global South into the conversations, to bring the capacities also from the knowledge that is there, in order to make sure that the whole world goes on the same path.
Great. No, thank you, Daphna. Thanks for that there. How can different stakeholders support D4D capacity building through focused investments, through skill development programs or institutional mechanisms? Maybe, Jojo, you want to come back in and give us a perspective around that.
Yep. So one common view is that when we think of capacity, we think about it as existing entirely within one institution or one organization. But the reality is that capacity exists, different sorts of capacities exist within different sectors, within different organizations, right? So how can we set in place mechanisms to actually leverage each other's capacities in different areas, especially when it comes to things like data? An example of this is, say, if a government is looking at data on potholes on roads, right? Is there a way to incentivize the private sector? We can go to the Ubers of the world, and we can go to the Ola cabs of the world and say, hey, can you put on your accelerometers and share this data back with the government, so they get a sense of where the potholes are, and they can get rectified, right? Is there a way to go and incentivize academic institutions, for example, who are rich in these capabilities, to work with the civil sector, to work with governments on imparting not just the capacities, but doing joint research? So those are the lines on which we think about capacity, and how do you work across institutions?
Great. No, thanks for that. Diana, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, I think it's really impressive how global cooperation has advanced and improved and strengthened. But I feel that is not the same at national level. There's still a tendency to operate in a competing manner at national level, and in a very siloed manner as well. One of the biggest challenges that a lot of governments face is around coordination. And unfortunately, in many instances, development organizations, we exacerbate that challenge due to our siloed approach in rolling out national level projects, and then particularly in countries where there's a lot of dependency on development aid and support. So I think it's really critical to ensure that that what we are seeing at the global stage also replicates at the national stage, that there is stronger coordination and collaboration with the government from the project design and perspective all the way up to the monitoring of the same. When looking from a data perspective, even just national reporting against the SDGs. I think at national level, there's a big gap, and I think here is where different institutions can really leverage the resources that they have at the country level and think about what would be the most coordinated manner to really report and track against the SDGs, and I think that is really going to roll up to the national level as well. And I think beyond, when thinking about data for development, many times we can have we're more inclined to think around, the how to build and maintain and govern. I think bringing in the human-centric approach, which I really appreciate that was brought into this development working group session, is also key, because at the end of that stage, there needs to be that capacity to support now the citizens and the wider population and guidance to build that trust and accountability as well. And I think this is where cooperation between private sector, development agencies and governments to really ensure that this is done in a coordinated manner, and then that also that there is the right capacity to address and simplify and demystify the sensitivities and concerns around data when now maybe responding to questions or challenges or support requests. So this could be through help desks, through outreach grassroots campaign, and I think all these can really roll up to really maximize that the diversified investment, both at national, regional, and then also at the global stage.
No, thanks, Diana. Thanks for that. Also, there are implications if we don't build capacity, if we don't address the issue of addressing data for development capacity, especially in the developing countries. These implications are far and far-reaching. Daphna, would you like to kick us off and just share with us a perspective around the implications if we don't build the capacity? What then?
Thank you. I think, first of all, we have to keep in mind again the different level of capacities that we referred, no? The capacities of the developers, the decision makers, and the users. But also, I think the most important thing is that we are just going to make this world worse, because the gaps within countries and between countries will be enormous, and this have consequences for the world, as we know, when we don't go all of us on the same boat. It's like climate change. Some are taking measures on some issues and some others not, but at the end we are all living in the same world. And at the moment, and this world is going into a crisis emergency, as you see. Now, I think it is important that we try to really strengthen the South and the capabilities of the rest of the world, because currently is very centralized in some companies and in some countries. And all the harvesting of the information is also done in countries where the legal systems and frameworks are very weak. And this is just going to deepen the problem, for this national, for the national capacities, and hence for the rest, for the capacities. And I think also it is also very important, because all these technologies are being developed ignoring the diversity of the world that we are living in. So I think we can even go so far as to question the relevance of these technologies for the rest of the world, because they are basically ignoring their needs and the realities of basically the rest of the world, except for those very few countries and very few companies that are developing these technologies. So I think the consequences are huge, because as we know, this information is used now to make decisions, very important decisions about investments, about education, about how are we going to prepare the future generations. So if we continue on this path, we are just going to it's a very perverse way of featuring the future.
Great. No, thanks, Daphna. Jojo, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick off from where Daphne left off, and so you said something interesting about on diversity, right? And it just begs the question then, when we're talking of D4D, data for development, maybe we should also think about WD4WD, right, which is whose data for whose development. And while we've spoken about large data sets and interoperability and data sharing between countries, between between international organizations, etc., I think there's also a view to look at small data, right? Data that helps an individual to make a decision, and this is everyone who's working on the field. Maybe it's a frontline worker, especially when you're talking of governments that are working on large projects, large schemes, large systems, right? Can everyone have the relevant piece of data that helps them make a decision in real time, right? So it's a frontline worker that makes a decision on entering some data. There's an employee within the organization that knows exactly what data to act on and pass on. There's an administrator that's looking at a dashboard and knows what decision to make in real time. And unless you have this at the core, it's very hard to make the system move. It breaks at multiple levels. So that's I think what I would like to add, that while we're talking of big data sets, let's also think about small data and the individual to restore agency back to the person to whom it matters.
Whose data for whose development? A very interesting catch-off and payoff line there. Small data, again, let's think about the individuals and creating value to the people whose data we actually take and harvest. Chrissy, over to you.
Yeah, so you ask what could happen if we don't do this, and I think of, if any of you read a few years back, there's a novel that came out called The Ministry of the Future, which is a dystopian near future novel about climate change and the dangers of the lack of climate action. In the first few pages of this novel, that's supposed to kind of make this more entertaining, I guess, it starts out with, over the past few decades, which are the future decades for us, governments just failed to report on the metrics that they committed to for climate action, and that's how they kind of say, and that's how we get to this place, to this dystopian future where we weren't able to tackle such a pressing global challenge. And I think it's hard to imagine, I think that there's all very small scale ways that things can go wrong if we don't invest in the capability to handle data at all levels, to handle and use it to address these problems. And then there's very big picture dystopian scenarios as well. I think all of these are real. It's hard to argue against the fact that we now live in a world where digital data is a very real part of our government systems, are part of our daily lives, and it's almost, I think it can't be overemphasized how much we need to invest in these if we want to, in digital and data capacity, if we want to meet the SDGs and solve these kind of pressing global problems that are facing us all.
Thanks, Chrissy. Thanks for that. It's about visualizing the data. It's about having data available at all levels. Diana, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think my fellow panelists have covered most of them, but I think one area where I would add is around the people-centered approaches towards data for development. I think if capacities are not built, particularly to make sure that the population is actually moving at the same pace with the governments, with the private sector, where the momentum has already been built, we need to ensure that we are carrying the citizens and the people along in terms of their awareness. Are they aware of these issues that are being brought about? When national digital policies and data protection systems are being developed, there needs to be an awareness in the general populace also, because you might have the best policies, the best platforms, but if that data is not collected in a responsible manner, then I think we would still be lagging behind. And I think responsibility also comes, it's two-way. while it is collected responsibly, there needs to be an aware population, an aware individual at the end of the line who is actually giving that consent and is knowingly aware of what they're providing. So I think capacities, thinking of capacity through that entire lens, from the institutional and then also from the population perspective, I think it's critical to make sure that there is consistent momentum across the entire value chain and that we do not leave the people behind.
It's about people, and the very same people in whose data that we actually take and use to make informed decisions. If I have to ask each one of you, we've got a very short space of time, in 30 seconds, what would be the key message you'd like to leave delegates in this room to take away about capacity building in the data for development space? If I can kick off with you, Daphna, 30 seconds, key message, one key message for the delegates in the room.
Well, I think please consider the ethical approach, because the ethical approach is not about philosophy, it's not about values in the vacuum, it is about inclusivity, it is about diversity, it is about transparency, it is about accountability, it is about really making sure that we accompany the development of technologies to ensure the well-being of the individuals and of the societies.
Thank you so much, Daphna. Kirsty, over to you. 30 seconds, please.
Sure, I'm just reiterating my previous points. I do think, as you all know, data is a cross-cutting issue. It addresses all of the SDGs. It doesn't get confined to borders. It doesn't get confined to sectors. And so I think the more as we look at building capacity and really building that mindset to work across sectors, to work across existing silos, traditional fragmentation, the more value we'll get out of all of the data that's being collected.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks for that. Diana?
I think for me it's a challenge just to make sure that we replicate this international cooperation both at national and at grassroots level, and hopefully come up with even, what are the, from a principles perspective, from a process perspective, what does that look like, and how can we move on and continue these conversations once we all go back to our respective countries. Thank you.
Jojo, you have the final word on this. 30 seconds, please.
Thanks. So I think the few points that we keep in mind is think about the individual, empower them, make sure that the agency is restored back to the individual. That's one. To think about the quality of the data and make sure that it's verifiable, it's trustworthy, trust is at the core of the data. Look at interoperability from the start. That is what leads to sharing of data, because not everyone can have all data at all times. So even when you're looking at building capacity, it is about distributing this capacity across different levels, different stakeholders. And the final thought that I had, which I didn't cover earlier, is that when we're thinking about anything to do with data, right, that there is a tendency in all of us to think about the perfect conception of what this ideal data set would look like. And I think there we just need to start small, go minimal, look at minimal data that is useful for everyone. Think about very simple things like geolocations, think about postcodes, think about data from different sets that have come together to solve problems, to address problems that we didn't even know are going to come up. To think about climate change, think about COVID, on how multiple data sets were used. But at that point in time, just look at minimal data. That would be my 30 seconds.
Thank you, Jojo. Thanks for that. Distinguished delegates, colleagues, data for development and capacity building. Capacity building is so essential. It's the driver that will drive us in the digital economy. Capacity building is there so that it enhances the data dividend. It transfers the value back to the user. It creates transparency. It builds trust. It builds the information required so that we meet the SDGs. It empowers and powers development. With that, I'd like to thank all our panelists for a very, very engaging conversation and some serious knowledge sharing here. So thank you so much for all your contributions today. Thank you.
Let's thank our moderator and our eminent panelists. Thank you very much. And I request you to please be with us on stage as I invite DWG Co-Chair Ambassador Naidu once again to please do the honors and felicitate our esteemed panelists, sir. And at this juncture, may I once again invite Mr. Siddharth Hande, founder Kabaddi Wala Connect. Now he's here with us. Let's have a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for Mr. Siddharth Hande. Mr. Fayaz King, thank you so much, sir. Ms. Diana Sang. Ms. Chrissy Mayer. Mr. Jojo Mehra. Ms. Daphna Feinholz. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the applause, and I'm going to request you, esteemed panelists, for a group photo opportunity. Thank you very much once again, and now I shall hold back Ambassador Naidu for the closing remarks.
Thank you, everyone. I think we had a very, very delightful and very constructive conversations this morning. A lot of food for thought, and we have our lunch being set up outside, and we hope all of you you've seen the panelists, you've seen how they've aired their views. Data for development starts right at the designing phase and up to its monitoring phase. It has its dividends, it has its dark sides, and it is very, very important, as we heard the panelists today, how do we work with the frameworks, the guardrails that need to be put in place. So while trust is very, very key for it, it is also very, very important for the developing South to also understand the value of data and the need for capacity building. With that, I thank all of you for coming in early into Kumarakom and partaking today in this side event. We have a very exciting afternoon side event too, so please, we will be very, very delighted to now host you for a lunch. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, sir. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I request all HODs and delegates to please proceed to 4 Square Hall, which is the adjacent hall, Conference Hall 2, for lunch now. And friends from the media, I request you to please proceed to Green Arch. Thank you very much once again, ladies and gentlemen, for your enthused participation. We will now take a 1 hour, exactly 1 hour long lunch break. It's 12:52 now. I request you to please come back in an hour. And we will be beginning with our next side event, which is themed, which is around lifestyles for environment and just green transition. So we will come back, ladies and gentlemen, in exactly 1 hour to resume the proceedings with the next side event. So thank you very much once again. I request you to please join us for lunch and come back in maybe a couple of minutes before 1 hour.